Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, in dangerous conditions, with no job security and barely enough pay to survive. This wasn't just an unfortunate reality for a few, it was the daily existence of millions of workers. The factories of the Industrial Revolution, the coal mines, the railroads, and the textile mills were built on the backs of exhausted laborers, many of whom were children. But these conditions didn't just continue unchecked. A powerful force emerged to challenge them: the labor movement. The labor movement was born out of necessity, driven by the desperate need for fair wages, reasonable working hours, and basic protections. It was a movement of ordinary people, factory workers, miners, dock workers, and servants, who came together to demand change. And their struggle wasn't easy. It was a fight marked by brutal crackdowns, violent clashes with law enforcement, and even loss of life. But the sacrifices made by those early workers shaped the world we live in today. The reason we have weekends, 8-hour workdays, workplace safety regulations, and even the concept of a minimum wage is because of their relentless efforts at Xiao. Its core, the labor movement, was about power: who had it and who didn't. Employers held all the cards, dictating conditions, wages, and hours without consequence. But as workers organized into unions, they found strength in numbers. Strikes became their most potent weapon, a means of shutting down industries to force employers to listen. Some of the most significant strikes in history, like the 1894 Pullman strike or the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory protests, highlighted the injustices of the system and often led to major reforms. This movement wasn't just about economic struggles, it was deeply tied to social justice. The fight for racial and gender equality often intersected with labor rights, as Black workers, women, and immigrants fought not only for better pay, but for basic recognition and dignity in the workplace. Figures like Mary Harris, Mother Jones, A. Philip Randolph, and Cesar Chavez emerged as champions of workers' rights, proving that labor activism wasn't confined to one era or one group. It was a fight for all. The impact of the labor movement is still felt today. Workers' rights continue to be a battleground, with debates over fair wages, corporate power, automation, and gig economy jobs shaping modern labor struggles. The history of the labor movement isn't just a story of the past, it's an ongoing fight that affects us all. Whether you realize it or not, the rights you enjoy at work today were won through generations of sacrifice and resistance. The labor movement didn't emerge overnight. It was born out of the massive economic and social changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution. Before factories and mass production, most people worked in small workshops or as independent artisans, controlling their own schedules and skills. But as industries expanded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the nature of work transformed. Machines replaced skilled craftsmanship, and massive factories sprang up, demanding a new kind of workforce, one that was cheap, replaceable, and endlessly available. The rise of factories completely reshaped society. People flooded into cities looking for work, leading to overcrowding, poor living conditions, and extreme poverty. In these new industrial workplaces, employers prioritized efficiency and profit above all else. Factory owners pushed workers to their limits, enforcing grueling schedules with shifts that lasted 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 or even 7 days a week. There were no breaks, no sick leave, and no protections if someone was injured on the job. For many, the workplace was a death trap. Machines had no safety features, fires were common, and accidents happened regularly, often costing workers their limbs or lives. One of the most horrifying aspects of early industrial labor was child labor. Children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work in factories, coal mines, and textile mills, performing backbreaking tasks for a fraction of an adult's wage. In textile mills, children had to crawl under dangerous machinery to fix broken threads, while in coal mines they worked in pitch-black tunnels for hours, inhaling toxic dust that destroyed their lungs. Many children were permanently injured, and some never made it out of the factories alive. The logic behind child labor was simple. Children were small, easy to control, and less likely to demand higher wages. For factory owners, they were the perfect workers. Despite the brutality of these conditions, early resistance to industrial exploitation did exist. In the pre-industrial world, skilled workers had been organized into guilds, associations that controlled training, wages, and working conditions. within specific trades. These guilds provided a degree of worker protection, ensuring that labor was valued and respected. But as factories replaced small workshops, these guilds lost their influence, and workers were left with no bargaining power. Some of the earliest forms of worker resistance came in the form of small-scale protests and strikes, but these were often crushed with force. The government and business owners viewed any attempt to organize as a threat to economic stability, and laws were put in place to prevent workers from unionizing. In England, for example, the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to form labor unions or strike. In the United States, early strikes were met with police violence and even military intervention. Employers used every tool available, blacklists, lockouts, and private security forces, to prevent workers from gaining power. Yet the seeds of the labor movement were already being planted. Workers knew that unless they stood together, conditions would never improve. Small labor organizations began to emerge, inspired by the old guild system, but adapted to the new industrial world. These early unions fought for basic rights, higher wages, shorter hours, and workplace safety. And although they faced brutal opposition, their persistence laid the foundation for the powerful labor movements that would later reshape history. The struggle of these early workers wasn't just about economics. It was about dignity, survival, and the right to be treated as something more than just a cog in the industrial machine. Their efforts, though often overlooked, were the first steps toward the labor rights we take for granted today. As industrialization surged in the 19th century, workers realized that individual protests or small-scale strikes weren't enough to force change. Employers held too much power, and governments often sided with business owners, using police or even the military to crush labor uprisings. Out of necessity, workers began to band together, forming labor unions, organizations designed to fight for better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. These unions quickly became one of the most powerful forces in American history, shaping the workplace as we know it today. One of the first major labor organizations in the United States was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869. Unlike later unions that focused primarily on skilled workers, the Knights of Labor took a radical approach, welcoming all workers regardless of skill level, race, or gender. They believed in broad social reforms, including the 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, and the abolition of child labor. Their inclusive nature made them incredibly influential, and by the 1880s, they had hundreds of thousands of members. However, the Knights' influence declined after a series of violent strikes, particularly the Haymarket Affair of 1886, where a labor protest in Chicago turned deadly after a bomb exploded, leading to a fierce government crackdown on organized labor. While the Knights of Labor faded, another organization rose to prominence, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. Unlike the Knights, the AFL focused on skilled workers and pragmatic goals, such as higher wages and better working conditions, rather than broad social change. Gompers believed in pure and simple unionism, emphasizing practical gains over political ideology. Under his leadership, the AFL grew into one of the most powerful labor organizations in the country, setting the stage for modern unionism. Another key figure in the labor movement was Eugene V. Debs, a passionate socialist and labor leader who played a crucial role in unionizing railway workers. He founded the American Railway Union, ARU, and led one of the most famous labor strikes in American history, the Pullman Strike of 1894. The strike began when the Pullman Company cut workers' wages while keeping rent high in company-owned housing. When Debs and the ARU called for a boycott of Pullman rail cars, the federal government intervened violently, sending troops to break the strike. Debs was arrested and imprisoned, but he emerged as an even more prominent figure in the labor movement, advocating for workers' rights through socialist politics. One of the most fearless and outspoken advocates for labor rights was Mary Harris Mother Jones. A fiery organizer and speaker, she became known as the most dangerous woman in America for her ability to rally workers into action. She was particularly passionate about ending child labor, often leading protests with young children who had been maimed by factory work. Her tireless activism helped push for stronger labor laws and protections for workers. The key weapon of labor, unions, was collective bargaining. the idea that workers, when united, could negotiate as a group rather than as individuals. In industries where unions had strong membership, they could negotiate contracts that guaranteed better wages, benefits, and working conditions. This was a radical shift from the earlier days of industrial labor, where employers dictated all terms with no worker input. The more workers joined unions, the more leverage they had, and in industries where strikes were well organized, companies had no choice but to meet demands or risk massive financial losses. Labor unions also became a driving force behind major legislative reforms. They played a crucial role in securing laws that regulated work hours, ensured safer conditions, and established the right to unionize. The struggle was often brutal, with companies hiring private security forces like the Pinkertons to break strikes, and some of the most famous strikes in history, like the Homestead Strike of 1892, turned into violent clashes. Despite these challenges, unions persisted, proving time and again that when workers stood together, they had the power to change history. By the early 20th century, labor unions had cemented themselves as a major force in American society. They weren't just fighting for better wages, they were demanding recognition of workers' dignity and their right to have a voice in their own workplaces. The battles they fought laid the foundation for the rights many workers enjoy today, from the 8-hour workday to workplace safety regulations. Their legacy continues to shape labor movements around the world, showing that the fight for workers' rights is never truly over. The history of the labor movement is filled with dramatic moments of confrontation between workers and those in power. Strikes were the most powerful tool workers had to demand better wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. However, strikes were also dangerous, as employers, the government, and even private security forces often responded with extreme violence. Some of the most significant labor conflicts in U.S. history not only shaped the labor movement, but also revealed the deep tensions between workers, industry leaders, and the government. One of the earliest and most explosive labor uprisings was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It began as a protest against wage cuts but quickly escalated into the first national strike in American history. Railroads were the backbone of the economy, and when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced a 10% wage cut for workers, on top of previous pay reductions, frustration boiled over. Railroad workers in West Virginia walked off the job, refusing to allow trains to run. The strike spread rapidly, reaching cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. Workers in other industries joined in solidarity, and soon entire cities were effectively shut down. The response was brutal. Local authorities and, eventually, the federal government sent in troops to break the strike. In Pittsburgh, the conflict turned into an all-out battle between workers and the military. Strikers set railroad property on fire and troops fired into crowds, killing dozens. Across the country, over 100 people were killed, and millions of dollars in property were destroyed. Though the strike ultimately failed, it sent a clear message. Workers were willing to fight back, and labor unrest was now a national issue. Just a few years later, another pivotal moment in labor history occurred, the Haymarket Affair of 1886. This event is closely tied to the fight for the 8-hour workday, a demand that had gained traction among labor activists, who argued that workers should not be forced to labor for 12 to 16-hour shifts. On May 1, 1886, thousands of workers across the country participated in rallies demanding an 8-hour day. In Chicago, tensions escalated over the next few days, and during a rally in Haymarket Square on May 4th, an unknown person threw a bomb into the crowd. The explosion killed 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians, and in the chaos, gunfire erupted. Dozens were injured, and the incident was used as justification to crack down on the labor movement. Authorities arrested several anarchist and labor leaders, even though there was no solid evidence linking them to the bombing. 4 of them were hanged, and 1 committed suicide in prison. The Haymarket Affair became a defining moment for labor rights activists around the world. It exposed the extreme hostility toward organized labor and solidified May 1st as International Workers' Day, celebrated in many countries as a day of worker solidarity. Another major confrontation came in 1894 with the Pullman strike, a strike that paralyzed the nation's railroad system and led to a deadly showdown between workers and the federal government. The Pullman Company, which manufactured luxury railroad cars, cut workers' wages by 25% while keeping rent and prices high in company-owned housing and stores. Workers, led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union, ARU, demanded better conditions, but the company refused to negotiate. In response, Pullman workers walked off the job, and the strike quickly spread to railroads across the country. With rail traffic at a standstill, railroad executives pressured the federal government to intervene. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops, claiming the strike disrupted mail delivery and interstate commerce. The arrival of troops in Chicago led to violent clashes, with soldiers firing into crowds and killing over a dozen workers. The government also arrested Debs, who was sentenced to prison. The strike ultimately collapsed, but it further exposed how deeply the government sided with big business over workers. However, public outrage over the strike's violent suppression led President Cleveland to establish Labor Day as a national holiday in an attempt to appease workers. Beyond the railroads and factories, some of the most intense labor struggles happened in the coal mines and textile mills, where conditions were especially brutal. In the coal mining industry, workers faced deadly conditions, collapsing tunnels, explosions, and lung disease from inhaling coal dust. Miners were often paid in company-issued scrip instead of real money, meaning they could only buy goods from company-owned stores, keeping them trapped in a cycle of poverty. When miners organized to demand fair pay and safer conditions, companies retaliated with force. Strikes like the anthracite coal strike of 1902, where miners demanded better wages and an 8-hour workday, led to national crises as coal supplies ran low. This strike was significant because President Theodore Roosevelt intervened, not to crush the strike, but to negotiate a fair settlement, marking one of the first times the federal government acted as a mediator rather than an enforcer of business interests. Textile mill workers, many of whom were women and children, also faced extreme exploitation. The Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912, led by immigrant workers in Massachusetts, became a symbol of the struggle for fair wages and decent working conditions. The strike, organized by the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, was sparked when mill owners cut workers' wages after reducing the legally mandated workweek from 56 to 54 hours. Women played a leading role in this strike, chanting, "We want bread, but we want roses too," a slogan that emphasized their demand not just for survival wages, but for dignity and a better quality of life. Despite violent repression, the strike was ultimately successful, leading to wage increases. These strikes and confrontations were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger battle between workers and corporate power. Each strike, whether it ended in victory or violent suppression, contributed to the growing demand for labor rights and inspired future generations of workers to keep fighting. The sacrifices made by those who stood on the picket lines, faced police batons, and risked their lives helped shape modern labor laws and the protections workers have today. But these struggles also serve as a reminder that many of the same issues, wage inequality, unsafe working conditions, and corporate influence over government, are still relevant in today's labor battles. From the earliest days of the labor movement, workers faced intense opposition not just from employers but also from the government itself. Throughout much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. government largely sided with business owners, using legal rulings, police forces, and even the military to suppress strikes and labor activism. The struggle for workers' rights was not just against harsh working conditions, but against a powerful system that actively resisted change. However, over time, as public outcry grew and reform movements gained traction, the government slowly began to shift toward enacting labor protections, marking the beginning of a new era in labor rights. Early government resistance and violent crackdowns. In the 19th century, governments at both the federal and state levels viewed labor organizing as a threat to economic stability. The dominant political and economic philosophy of the time was laissez-faire capitalism, which argued that the government should not interfere with business. However, when workers went on strike, authorities had no problem stepping in, almost always on the side of the employers. One of the most extreme examples of government repression came during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which was the first nationwide labor strike in U.S. history. When railroad workers walked off the job to protest wage cuts, state militias and federal troops were deployed to crush the movement. In Pittsburgh, troops fired into a crowd of strikers, killing over 20 people. The violence only fueled more strikes, but the government made it clear that it would use deadly force to protect corporate interests. The Pullman strike of 1894 was another major confrontation where the government played an active role in breaking labor resistance. After workers at the Pullman Company went on strike due to wage cuts and high rents in company-owned housing, the American Railway Union, ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, organized a massive boycott of Pullman railcars. In response, the federal government, under President Grover Cleveland, sent in the U.S. Army to restore rail service. Clashes between strikers and troops turned deadly, with over 30 workers killed. Debs was arrested and the strike was crushed. This was a turning point that showed how the federal government would go to great lengths to suppress organized labor. The role of corporate interests and strike-breaking beyond government crackdowns, corporations also used their vast wealth and influence to weaken the labor movement. Employers refused to negotiate with unions and used a variety of aggressive tactics to stop workers from organizing. One of the most infamous methods was strike-breaking, where companies hired non-union workers, often called scabs, to replace striking employees. This tactic created deep resentment within labor communities, as it allowed businesses to continue operations while union workers lost their leverage. Corporations also employed private security forces to violently suppress strikes. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, originally a private detective service, became notorious for being hired by businesses to infiltrate unions, intimidate workers, and even engage in outright violence. One of the most infamous incidents was the Homestead Strike of 1892, where steelworkers at Carnegie Steel clashed with 300 armed Pinkerton agents. The battle resulted in multiple deaths and injuries, and the strike ultimately failed, leading to the weakening of the steelworkers' union. Blacklisting was another common tactic. Union organizers and outspoken workers were blacklisted, meaning they were effectively banned from getting jobs in their industry. Companies would share names of troublemakers, ensuring that anyone who fought for labor rights would struggle to find work elsewhere. Corporate interests also heavily influenced politics. Business leaders funneled money into politicians who supported anti-union policies. Courts often ruled in favor of employers, with injunctions being a key legal tool used against unions. Judges frequently issued injunctions to prevent strikes, often citing them as illegal conspiracies against business operations. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, originally meant to regulate monopolies, was ironically used against unions, labeling strikes and boycotts as illegal restraints on trade. Shift toward labor protections and the Progressive Era. As the 20th century progressed, public sentiment began to shift in favor of workers. The extreme poverty, child labor, and dangerous working conditions exposed during the Gilded Age led to growing support for reform. The Progressive Era, 1890s-1920s, marked the beginning of a slow but significant transformation in the relationship between the government and labor. One of the key figures who pushed for change was Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901. Unlike previous presidents who had been staunchly pro-business, Roosevelt saw the need for balance. During the anthracite coal strike of 1902, coal miners demanded better pay and shorter hours. Instead of sending troops to crush the strike, Roosevelt intervened as a mediator, pressuring mine owners to negotiate with workers. This was a major shift. It was one of the first times the federal government acted as a neutral party rather than siding with business owners. The Progressive Era also saw new labor laws that addressed some of the worst abuses of industrial capitalism. Child labor laws began to emerge, limiting the age at which children could be employed and setting restrictions on work hours. Workplace safety regulations were introduced after disasters like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, where 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, died because factory doors were locked to prevent them from leaving during their shifts. The Department of Labor was established in 1913 to oversee labor conditions and advocate for workers' rights. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 clarified that labor unions were not illegal under antitrust laws, making it harder for businesses to use the courts to break strikes. Despite these advances, government support for labor rights remained inconsistent. The Red Scare of 1919-1920 led to crackdowns on radical labor activists, with many union leaders being arrested or deported under suspicion of communist influence. However, The groundwork had been laid for future labor victories. The biggest transformation came during the New Deal era of the 1930s, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced sweeping labor reforms in response to the Great Depression. The National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act of 1935, finally gave workers the legal right to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. It also created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, to enforce labor laws and mediate disputes between workers and employers. By the mid-20th century, labor unions had become a powerful force in American society, securing protections that previous generations had fought and died for. However, the struggle between labor and corporate power continued, with conflicts over wages, benefits, and working conditions persisting into the present day. The government's role in labor has always been a reflection of broader societal attitudes. Whether it was violently crushing strikes in the 19th century, cautiously mediating during the Progressive era, or actively supporting workers' rights. During the New Deal, the fight for labor protections has never been easy, but it has been one of the most defining struggles in shaping the modern workplace. By the early 1930s, the American labor movement was at a crossroads. The Great Depression had plunged millions of workers into unemployment, wages had collapsed, and unions were struggling to survive. Breadlines stretched for blocks, and desperate workers took any job they could find, often at starvation wages. Strikes became increasingly common as workers fought against pay cuts and worsening conditions, but businesses and government forces continued to crack down hard. It was clear that the old system wasn't working, and the economic crisis set the stage for a radical transformation of labor laws in the United States. The Great Depression and the labor crisis. The stock market crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through the economy. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. Those who still had jobs saw their wages slashed, while many employers lengthened work hours to extract more labor from their desperate employees. The situation was especially dire in industrial cities where factory closures left entire communities struggling to survive. During this period, the labor movement faced enormous challenges. Many businesses used the economic downturn as an opportunity to break unions, firing workers who attempted to organize and hiring desperate non-union labor to replace them. Police and private security forces were frequently called in to suppress strikes, often violently. Some of the most brutal confrontations occurred in coal mining towns, textile mills, and steel plants, where employers used everything from blacklisting to armed strikebreakers to maintain control. Despite the economic devastation, the early 1930s saw a wave of worker activism, as frustration boiled over into widespread labor unrest. One of the most significant events was the Ford Hunger March of 1932, where unemployed auto workers in Detroit protested for relief and jobs. Police and Ford's private security opened fire on the crowd, killing 5 people. Incidents like this galvanized public support for labor reforms and highlighted the desperate need for government intervention. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and the Wagner Act, 1935. The turning point came with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, in 1932. Promising a new deal for the American people, Roosevelt launched a series of sweeping economic and social reforms to pull the country out of the Depression. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the New Deal was its support for workers' rights and labor unions, a major shift from the previous era of government hostility toward organized labor. At the heart of Roosevelt's labor reforms was the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, of 1933, which encouraged businesses to adopt fair wages and working conditions. Though the Supreme Court struck down the NIRA in 1935, it paved the way for even stronger labor protections. The most significant labor law of the New Deal era was the Wagner Act, 1935, officially known as the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA. Named after Senator Robert F. Wagner, this groundbreaking law guaranteed workers the legal right to form unions, engage in collective bargaining, and strike without fear of employer retaliation. The Wagner Act also established the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, a federal agency tasked with investigating unfair labor practices, protecting workers from employer intimidation, ensuring that businesses recognized and negotiated with unions. This was a monumental victory for the labor movement. Before the Wagner Act, unions were often crushed by court rulings, police violence, or corporate resistance. Now, for the first time in U.S. history, the federal government actively protected workers' right to organize. As a result, union membership surged, rising from 3 million in 1933 to over 8 million by 1941. One of the most high-profile victories under the Wagner Act was the General Motors site-down strike, 1936 to 1937. Instead of picketing outside, workers at a GM plant in Flint, Michigan, occupied the factory, refusing to leave until their demands were met. After weeks of tense standoff, GM finally recognized the United Auto Workers, UAW union, a massive victory that inspired sit-down strikes across the country. The rise of modern labor protections, beyond empowering unions, the New Deal also introduced some of the most fundamental labor protections that still exist today. Some of the key reforms included the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938, established the first federal minimum wage, 25 cents per hour. Introduced the 40-hour workweek and required overtime pay for longer shifts. Prohibited child labor in many industries, setting the stage for stronger protections in the following decades. Social Security Act, 1935, created unemployment insurance, providing financial assistance to workers who lost their jobs. Established the Social Security system, ensuring retirees had some income after leaving the workforce. Provided disability benefits, marking one of the first federal safety nets for vulnerable workers. Workplace safety regulations. Although comprehensive, workplace safety laws wouldn't come until later, such as OSHA in 1970. The New Deal laid the groundwork by increasing federal oversight of working conditions. The government encouraged safer factory standards and limited excessive working hours to reduce workplace accidents. A lasting impact on workers' rights. The New Deal marked a turning point in American labor history. For the first time, the government was not just an enforcer of corporate interests, but an advocate for workers' rights. The Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act transformed the workplace, ensuring that workers had protections against exploitation. However, the fight was far from over. Business leaders and conservative politicians fiercely opposed the new labor laws, warning that they would hurt the economy. Over the years, corporate interests pushed back, leading to the Taft-Hartley Act 1947, which placed restrictions on unions and gave employers more power to fight back against strikes. Despite these challenges, the labor protections of the New Deal set the foundation for modern labor rights. Minimum wage laws, union protections, and workplace safety regulations all trace their origins back to this period. Even today, debates over labor policy, from raising the minimum wage to expanding union rights, are rooted in the battles fought during the 1930s. The legacy of the New Deal reminds us that the rights workers enjoy today weren't simply granted, they were won through decades of struggle, strikes, and activism. And just as workers fought for their rights in the past, new generations continue the battle for fair wages, safe workplaces, and stronger labor protections in the modern era. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the labor movement has continued to evolve in response to massive economic, technological, and political shifts. While the New Deal era brought historic gains for workers, the decades that followed saw both victories and setbacks as unions adapted to new challenges. From the rise of public sector unions to the modern fight for fair wages and workers' rights in the digital age, the labor movement has remained a powerful force, though its role has been increasingly debated in an era of globalization and automation. The impact of automation and globalization on labor. One of the biggest challenges faced by workers in the modern era has been the twin forces of automation and globalization, automation and the changing workforce. Since the mid-20th century, technological advancements have drastically changed industries, reducing the need for certain types of labor while increasing demand for new skills. The rise of industrial robots in manufacturing, for example, has led to the elimination of many assembly line jobs. In the auto industry alone, thousands of workers were displaced as machines took over repetitive, high-risk tasks. More recently, artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning have begun replacing white-collar jobs as well, automating roles in finance, customer service, and even legal work. While technology has created new job opportunities, it has also led to growing concerns about job security and wage stagnation. Many workers find themselves forced into the gig economy or part-time positions without traditional benefits like health insurance, pensions, or paid leave. Globalization and outsourcing at the same time, globalization has transformed the labor market. Starting in the late 20th century, companies began outsourcing jobs to countries with lower labor costs, leading to the decline of industrial jobs in the United States and other developed nations. In the 1980s and 1990s, as companies sought to maximize profits, factories were shut down, and manufacturing jobs were sent overseas to countries like China, Mexico, and India, where wages were significantly lower. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994, further accelerated this trend by making it easier for businesses to relocate production to Mexico. Many former industrial strongholds in the U.S., such as Detroit and Pittsburgh, became known as part of the Rust Belt, suffering from economic decline, high unemployment, and shrinking union membership. For American workers, these changes meant fewer stable, high-paying jobs, especially for those without college degrees. While globalization lowered consumer prices, it also weakened the bargaining power of unions, as companies could simply move operations to another country if labor costs became too high. The rise of public sector unions, as private sector unions began to decline due to globalization and automation. Public sector unions, representing government employees such as teachers, police officers, firefighters, and postal workers, became a major force in the labor movement. Unlike industrial unions, public sector unions negotiated directly with state and federal governments rather than private corporations. They became particularly influential in the 1960s and 1970s, when laws were passed allowing government workers to unionize in many states. One of the most significant moments in this era was the formation of teachers' unions, such as the National Education Association, NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers, AFT. These organizations fought for better pay, smaller class sizes, and improved working conditions in public schools. Another powerful group was the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, which represents public workers ranging from sanitation workers to social service employees. Public sector unions became some of the largest and most politically influential labor organizations, playing a major role in elections and policy debates. However, public sector unions have also faced increasing political opposition. Some argue that their ability to negotiate for higher wages and pensions puts a strain on government budgets, while others see them as an essential check on government power. This debate became especially heated in Wisconsin in 2011, when Governor Scott Walker pushed through laws limiting the collective bargaining rights of public workers, sparking mass protests and national controversy. Modern labor movements. The fight for $15, Amazon and Starbucks union efforts. While traditional union membership has declined, the 21st century has seen the rise of new labor movements, particularly among low-wage workers. The fight for $15, one of the most well-known modern labor movements, is the fight for $15, which began in 2012 when fast food workers in New York City staged a walkout demanding a $50 minimum wage and union rights. The movement quickly gained national attention, inspiring protests across the country and influencing policy changes. Several states, including California, New York, and Illinois, have since raised their minimum wages to $15 per hour. Large corporations like Amazon and Target have also increased wages due to public and worker pressure. While critics argue that raising the minimum wage could lead to job losses, supporters emphasize that it's necessary to keep up with the rising cost of living and to ensure that full-time workers can escape poverty wages. Amazon and Starbucks union efforts. In addition to the fight for $15, recent years have seen a surge in unionization efforts at major corporations, particularly at Amazon and Starbucks. Amazon Workers United. In 2021, workers at an Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, made headlines with a high-profile unionization effort. Though the initial vote failed, it marked a new wave of labor activism within the tech and logistics industries. In 2022, an Amazon facility in Staten Island, New York, became the first Amazon warehouse to successfully unionize, despite strong resistance from the company. Starbucks Workers United. Baristas at Starbucks locations across the U.S. have also launched union drives, fighting for better pay, job security, and more predictable scheduling. Despite corporate pushback, hundreds of Starbucks locations have voted to unionize, signaling a shift in labor organizing within the service industry. These movements represent a new generation of workers who are rethinking labor rights in the digital age. Many young workers who previously saw unions as outdated are now recognizing their importance in an economy where corporations wield immense power over wages and working conditions. The debate over unions today, are they still necessary? Despite these modern labor victories, unions remain a controversial topic. Supporters argue that unions are essential for protecting workers from exploitation, securing fair wages, and ensuring safe working conditions. However, opponents claim that unions have become bureaucratic, overly powerful, and out of touch with today's economy. Arguments in favor of unions: higher wages and better benefits. Unionized workers earn an average of 10–30% more than their non-union counterparts and are more likely to have healthcare and retirement benefits. Stronger workplace protections. Unions help prevent unjust firings, workplace discrimination, and unsafe conditions. Political influence. Labor unions advocate for worker-friendly policies, such as paid family leave and improved labor laws. Arguments against unions. Potential job losses. Some argue that high union wages make businesses less competitive, leading to outsourcing or layoffs. Union corruption and bureaucracy. Critics point to cases where unions have mismanaged funds or protected underperforming workers. Flexibility versus rigidity. Some workers prefer the flexibility of non-union jobs, especially in industries like tech and gig work. The future of the labor movement. As industries continue to change, the labor movement must adapt. The rise of remote work, gig jobs, and AI-driven automation presents new challenges that traditional unions weren't designed to address. However, the resurgence of worker activism in retail, tech, and service industries shows that the fight for labor rights is far from over. Whether through traditional unions or new worker-led movements, the struggle for fair wages, job security, and dignity in the workplace remains a defining issue in the modern economy. The question isn't just whether unions are still necessary, but how they must evolve to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The story of the labor movement is a story of struggle, sacrifice, and progress. From the brutal working conditions of the Industrial Revolution to the modern fight for fair wages and job security, workers have fought and continue to fight for their rights. Without these movements, the workplace as we know it today would be unrecognizable. How labor movements shaped our modern work environment. Many of the workplace protections we take for granted today are direct results of labor activism. Consider this: the 8-hour workday and 40-hour workweek, fought for by unions. Overtime pay, the result of labor laws pushed by worker movements. Minimum wage laws, achieved through years of strikes and advocacy. Child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, paid sick leave, and the right to unionize. None of these would exist without the labor movement. Every time you clock in at work and know that you're entitled to fair wages, that you can't be fired without cause, or that your workplace must meet basic safety standards, you are benefiting from decades, if not centuries, of labor activism. These victories weren't handed down by businesses or governments out of generosity. They were won by ordinary people who stood up, protested, and demanded better. Worker activism continues today. While labor unions once dominated industries like manufacturing and mining, today's worker activism looks different. The modern labor movement is fighting new battles in new industries. The fight for $15. Low-wage service workers demanding a livable wage. Amazon and Starbucks union efforts. Workers organizing against corporate giants. Gig worker rights. Rideshare drivers and freelancers pushing for fair pay and benefits. The rise of remote work and AI. A new era of workplace challenges that require new labor protections. Despite corporate resistance and legal setbacks, today's workers continue to organize, proving that the spirit of the labor movement is still alive. Are unions still important today? As we look to the future, one big question remains: are labor unions still necessary in today's economy? Some argue that unions have outlived their usefulness, while others believe that in an era of increasing corporate power, workers need unions more than ever. What do you think? Are labor unions still relevant in today's workforce? Should more workers push for union protections? What challenges do you think modern labor movements face? Let us know in the comments. Your opinion matters. And the conversation about workers' rights is far from over. If history has taught us anything, it's that change happens when people come together and demand it.